Hello, I'm Casimir MacLean, the author of Black Man Listen, a biography of the life of my paternal grandfather, Ralph Casimir. I want to share some ideas and reflections about the process of writing this biography. If the subject of your biography is living, it is important to seek their permission to write about their life. In my case, this was not so, but I did discuss my intentions with my father and one of my aunts. I set about this project by considering what I already knew and what I needed to find out. I knew that he had been a staunch Garveyite, involved in local politics, and a poet. However, to establish the facts, I was aware that I would have to do some extensive research. I had some experience of academic research, but I am not a historian. A biography should be rooted in facts and information collected from reliable sources. I began my research with the J.R. Ralph Casimir collection, which at that point was held in the basement of the Rosa Public Library. There I found the books that he had donated from his private collection. There were collections of magazines and other written materials that he had bound together. These included his compilation of the Book of Negro Poets. There were also letters from which I was able to copy anthologies of his own poetry and copies of the first anthologies of the Dominican poets he had collected and published. What I found added to my knowledge of his interests in literature and writing poetry, and those he had corresponded with, including Langston Hughes and Sylvia Pankhurst. There were also newspaper articles, including the serialized version of A Pan-African in Dominica by Tony Martin, a professor of Wellesley University College in the USA. This had been published by the Dominica Chronicle in 1990. My next port of call was a visit to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, New York, where my grandfather's documents, the J.R. Casimir Papers 1919 to 1981, are held. There I found a wealth of material related to Casimir's UNIA activities, his interests in Black history, his poetry, and rare publications he had collected. Much of this was already in the public domain via Martin's writings and the Marcus Garvey UNIA papers. To tell my story of my grandfather's life, I felt it important to contextualize it historically, socially, and culturally, in order to establish what life in Dominica had been like when he was growing up, and to look at the wider world picture of the time. I read books about the Pan-African movement, about Marcus Garvey's life from different perspectives, his published speeches and accounts of the experiences of the soldiers of the British West Indian Regiment during the First World War. I was very conscious that I needed to get the facts right and to ensure reliability and validity by not just trusting one source. I read anything I could find about education in Dominica and the wider Caribbean in the early 20th century. I also searched for any first-hand accounts of life in Dominica at that time. I bore in mind when reading that there's always an element of bias in historical writing. What is remembered or erased is never accidental. Historical writing is never apolitical. Hence, it was important to explore a range of materials. Despite all this, I felt that there was something missing from the picture that I had. While speaking to my father about my research, he casually mentioned that he had a file with some more personal family papers. This was pure gold, as amongst it all was a diary that Casimir had kept up to 1925. There were also letters from his mother and his brother. Throughout the documents I came across, there were references to him having been a councillor and involved in other local political activity. However, I could find little concrete detail. My next step was to research newspapers published during the relevant period. I found not only articles relating to Casimir's political activities, but also the context in which they took place and how they were received by those in power. I was able to find newspaper archives online and spent much of lockdown in 2020 reading ancient Dominican newspapers. It was those newspapers that saved me from making a grave mistake. The report of the first emancipation celebrations which my grandfather was involved in were reported in the UNIA papers, a highly respectable source, as taking place on 1st and 2nd August 1921. In my subsequent reading, I read accounts of Casimir's activities in Trinidad, where he was helping to build the UNIA chapters there between June and mid-August 1921. Obviously, he could not have been in two places at once. I searched through the Dominican newspaper reports for 1921 and found a report of emancipation celebrations, but they were not those described in the UNIA papers. I then decided to look at the same period in 1920, and there I found a substantial article giving an account of the first celebrations led by the Dominica UNIA division. I could then be assured of the correct date in which it had taken place. I also interviewed my aunts, my siblings, and his friends who were still alive to acquire a rounded view of the man from a range of perspectives. Lennox Hennichurch, who knew and collaborated with my grandfather, was a font of knowledge on Dominica's social history. Although my first chapter takes the form of a very personal account of my relationship with my grandfather, I subsequently tried to maintain an objective stance by writing in the third person and to give a balanced perspective presenting both his strengths and flaws with nuance and context. When I was considering how to write the biography, I took a mixed approach, alternating between life events and themes. I tried to be sensitive in my reporting, bearing in mind that although my subject was dead, I had to take into consideration the ethics of how the biography might affect his family and his legacy. Thank you for listening.